This past October, a ceremonial ribbon cutting was held in Gillette. The ceremony was to celebrate the location of Gillette's second city hall being officially listed on the National Register of Historic Places by the U.S. Department of Interior. We spoke to Mary Kelly of the Gillette Historic Preservation Committee about what kind of work went into getting the building on the register.
This building was our city hall for quite a while, from the mid-1930s until about 1983, I believe, was when the last department left here to go over to the new building. When it was City Hall, the fire department was in the back, the police was downstairs. In fact, there are 2 jail cells down there still. It had departments that moved out partway through, I think in the 70s. They used the building down the street that's the old post office. But since 1936 until about the mid-70s, all of the departments were here. Then some of the departments moved down to the old post office and they built the other building over on Kendrick. And so I believe everything was out of here and out of there in the early 80s. There are a couple of criteria to be listed on the National Register. One is that it has to be significant in history, and it can be our local history, it can be our state history, our national history. It needs to be significant. And we consider a city hall with the mayor's office and all the government offices to be significant in Gillette's history, especially because this was during the CCC years, the Civilian Conservation Corps years, the Depression years. This was a very important building to be built at that time when a lot of the country was in a depression and Gillette was still able to build this building. Besides significant, it has to look the way it did back the day it was built, so 1936 basically. And that's where a brick front, a brick exterior, also the stone exteriors on some of our buildings. Those are the buildings that we're going to be looking at to add to the National Register. So it has to basically look the way it did the day it was built. Gillette Historic Preservation Commission is a city board. We were appointed, the members of the commission were appointed by the mayor and the council, and our goal is to preserve our architecture, our history, as far as our physical history goes. So our primary goal or mission given to us by the city is that we will inventory all the buildings that are at least 50 years old, which I forgot to mention was the other criteria to be listed on the National Register. So we are to do an inventory of all the buildings on Gillette Avenue or close to the downtown area that are at least 50 years old and are significant to our history and look the way they did when they were built. So our first one, the first one that we did, that I did actually before we had a Historic Preservation Commission, was the old post office. So we did that one in 2008. And then our board was created about 2015, I believe, and this was a building that I had some research done on already, so we kind of were able to take some shortcuts there in moving this one along. We do have to put in a match, an in-kind match, either cash or in our case we did surveys of a lot of the buildings on Gillette Avenue, which we volunteered our time, which has a value, and so that was taken against the grant that we got for the consultant to write this nomination. It's not something that we totally did by ourselves. We definitely had some professional help, and we were really, really pleased with that. The City of Gillette decided some years ago to apply to be a certified local government, or a CLG. And that means that they have made a commitment to historic preservation. and they formed a board, which was the Gillette Historic Preservation Commission, and our job is to work on that historic preservation. CLGs can apply for grants through the State Historic Preservation Office or the National Park Service. If a building is listed on the National Register, there are tax grants also available to that business owner if they choose to make some renovations, some preservation upgrades to the building. We are actually in the process of applying for a National Historic District for pretty much Gillette Avenue. I'm not sure how far south it's going to go. It may go to 5th Street, it may go to 7th Street. I'm not sure if it's going to go all the way to 7th Street just because of the buildings that are in those last 2 blocks. But it will go from 1st Street up to probably 5th Street so that we can include the George Amos Library and the old Trinity Lutheran Church, which is George Dunlap. So great question. We're going big. We are hoping for a historic district, which means a lot of the buildings down here, whether they're contiguous or not, will be, I guess, lumped together into a historic district, and then that can be advertised up on I-90 to bring in those folks who like to travel and visit places for heritage tourism, learn more about the culture and the history of the place they're visiting.
We now visit with one of the current owners of the building, and they discuss what it means to them to have the building on the National Register.
Really, I moved into this building in about 2001, and I was renting a space in the back. And you know, I really fell in love with the building. I've lived here in Gillette pretty much all of my life, and so you kind of enjoy the history and the architecture of the stuff that's downtown, the older architecture. And I always said that if the building ever become available for sale, I was going to buy it. And so when the original owner the owner that had it while I was renting, he had passed away, and his wife decided that she was going to sell the property. I pulled 3 other gentlemen in with me, and we bought the building at that time. And that was about 2010 when we bought the building. So for me, to have our building listed on the National Historic Register, it's just really exciting, and it shows the architecture and that you know, older buildings are appreciated these days, and hopefully it will be preserved for generations to come. You know, it's always nice to see these older buildings actually get recognized as well. It's great to have our partner down the street that was the first and we're the second, and to see what the Historical Society will actually do downtown or anywhere else in Gillette and get these older buildings actually recognized. So for me, there's a couple of things that I would say. Number one would be the brick, you know, just having this brick in this community. If you think about what, back in those days, what it took to build this building, it was all done, you know, by masons, and they had their string lines, and that's how they put it up. So there are just some little things that make it unique in that situation. Then downstairs in the basement, the old jail cells are still there. There's 2 of them. And being able to go down there and look at that and see and hear different stories about things that have happened down there from people that grew up in the area. I remember as a kid when Tiny Fritzler was one of the police officers here, and I can remember at Halloween time bringing our candy down and going into the stairs, and they had an x-ray machine at the bottom, and you put your bag of candy on it, and they'd run it through to make sure that nobody did anything bad to it, right? And so then you pick up your candy and leave at the other end. And so those are just the little things that stick with you from when you were a kid about different things that happen in Gillette.
Next, we speak with Campbell County Rockpile Museum Director Robert Henning to learn more about the history of the building.
Yeah, so the building, as you might have heard, is built in 1936. It is Gillette's second City Hall building. The first one is back down the street on the 200 block, and that building was built in 1898. And there's an interesting connection between the two. in that when the city wanted to build a new building, they actually swapped that property for this property. And so they traded the old city hall and $1,000 for this property. And this at the time was owned by John T. Daly. And so they swapped the property, and with an agreement that they would build a city hall here fairly quickly. It ended up taking a few months, and in the agreement it said if they don't get the city hall built and they're still occupying the old building, that they would start paying rent at a certain time. So that kind of made the city kind of get going a little bit on it. They tried to partner with both the county and the federal government to make this building happen. Both of those partnerships fell apart. They weren't able to get public works funds, and the county at the time was struggling a little bit financially, primarily because a lot of county residents were moving into town. So you saw a shifting tax base. And so the city decided to do a loan, go alone on it. And so they drew the designs. They were able to hire the contractors and pay the bill out of their general fund. So similar to how it's done today, they made it happen. So that's, you know, some great history on the building. Well, if you think about the time period, it was City Hall. So you go from 36 to 84. And it wasn't City Hall necessarily alone at the end because the city was growing so much. But you saw just a massive shift in the community, right? So you get through the Great Depression, you get through World War II, and you had some federal offices in here during the Depression. Same for World War II. There was the draft board, I believe, was in here for a time. So you saw different entities use the building. And then you get into the 60s and 70s and the town starts to explode. So you see the jail's not large enough. The city government is growing by leaps and bounds. They go from basically 2 police officers to almost 100 overnight. Overnight, you know, maybe a couple decades. So, but it's seemingly becomes way too small really quickly. And so I think that's kind of what I think of when I think of this building, is that certain era that Gillette was a certain size and everything that happened during that almost 50 years. You have in the 1930s in Gillette, and even into earlier in the 20s, you see a lot of brick buildings being built. So if you walk up and down Gillette Avenue, you'll see a lot of brick, starting really in about 1920. And so that's something that is kind of a theme on Gillette Avenue. This one's a little bit later from some of those earlier brick buildings, and it shows Art Deco elements. And so right behind me, right in the center of the building, is kind of these stepped out brick features. And that is really the one main representative Art Deco feature. It is very similar to kind of those step outs you'd see on the more iconic Art Deco buildings, or even buildings that are no longer in Gillette, like the Fiesta Theater. It had that same kind of stepped out motif with kind of that central building feature. And so that's one thing. When they were originally designing it, they talked about some tile. Tile is a big Art Deco feature. You'll see some tile on other brick buildings downtown. This one didn't end up with any tile for whatever reason. But that's kind of a simple Art Deco feature. And in Wyoming architecture, a lot of times that's how it is. It's very subtle and simple. We don't oftentimes have those classic styles that you would see in the bigger cities or out east, but it's still there. And so that's why it was called Art Deco.